Now, let's turn to Korea as a middle power. Why suddenly people call Korea as a middle power? Let me explain some reasons for that. First, there was a status change of South Korea. Let me make some examples of the status change of Korea. First, former UN Secretary General Mr. Ban is Korean. And second, the Seoul hosted the G20 summit meeting in 2010. Not many countries is holding G20 summit meetings. And also, Korea was the first country having the free trade area agreement with the US and EU. It was the first country with the FTA with the United States and EU. And as of 2020, South Korea is the sixth largest, biggest trading country. And also, the size of economy of South Korea is 11th largest in the world. And besides, the size of South Korean defense expenditure is the 10th largest in the world. And lastly, it's a very significant. South Korea is the first country from an ODA recipient. ODA means Official Development Aid. In other words, South Korea used to receive money, grants, or borrowed money from other countries, from rich countries, from 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And from 1970s and 80s on, South Korea changed its status from recipient to an aid donor in the world history. South Korea is only one country and unique country that transformed its status from the ODA recipient to an aid donor in world history. Let's look at some details about the South Korean middle power policies. What kind of policies of South Korea can be included in the diplomacy of middle power? First, Roteus Nordpolitik. Nord means north politik. Before the 1988 Summer Olympics, President Roteus declared the Nordpolitik, and in 1988, Seoul had already obtained national power enough to approach the former Soviet Union and China. So Seoul government sent signals to the former Soviet Union and China to normalize its relations with South Korea. And secondly, President Kim Young-sam's globalization policy. With the globalization policy, the Kim Young-sam administration changed internal rules and norms in order to fit the international norms during his period. Thirdly, Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy. South Korea has enough power or capability in military and economic terms to match that of North Korea, and also it showed the already superiority over North Korea. So President Kim, the first time, mentioned Korea's role as a middle power. So President Kim used the word middle power in 1998. and President Lee Myung-bak's policy. Lee hosted the 2010 G20 summit meeting in Korea and declared the reduction of its CO2 emissions by 30% by the year 2020. It was a provoking announcement by a leader of a country. Reducing the carbon dioxide emissions means that the country is giving up certain percentage of economic growth. Anyway, he declared the reduction of the carbon dioxide by 30% in 10 years. But unfortunately, his promise was not kept by the year 2020. Anyway, he hosted the G20 summit meeting in Korea, and he expressed his willingness to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. And President Park Geun-hye's Trust Politique and Eurasian Initiative. And this slogan contained the establishment of the cross-Korean railroad that would connect to the Siberian Railroad. And so the cargo and merchandise from South Korea could reach to the European side within 2 weeks if they use the Trans-Siberian Railroad and Trans-Korean Railroad. And obviously, Japanese paid a great attention to the idea of the Eurasian Initiative. In her Trust Politique and Eurasian Initiative purported to establish a network of energy and logistics between Asia and Europe. And lastly, the President Moon Jae-in's Korean peace process to abolish the mutual hostility and war threat, and also to achieve a nuclear-free peninsula and prosperous Northeast Asia. Obviously, the slogan of nuclear-free peninsula are welcomed by North Korea too. But the intention or concept of nuclear-free peninsula are different between the two Koreas. When South Korean leaders are saying nuclear-free peninsula, it's virtually no nuclear weapons in the Korean peninsula. But when the North Korean leader says nuclear-free peninsula, that means the withdrawal of US forces from South Korea. Until then, North Korea would maintain the nuclear weapons. So they're using the same word, but with totally different intentions. Let me illustrate 3 criteria for Seoul as a middle power. First, power position. Seoul's power position in the middle of international hierarchy. Seoul is physically or geographically in the middle. Seoul is not a major state nor a lesser state. In East Asia, China and Japan, on the one hand, they are major states, and ASEAN countries on the other, lesser states. Seoul is in the middle between these 2 groups of the countries. Secondly, Seoul has been contributing peace and stability with a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Virtually no nuclear weapons in the peninsula. Also, PKO, Seoul has been sending South Korean troops to all over the world as a peacekeeping operation. and also anti-piracy operations. So South Korea has been actively participating in many operations in the world peace and stability with the United Nations. So in sum, Seoul's power position is in the middle between the major powers and lesser powers. Second, geography. Let's look at the geography of South Korea. Korea has a comprehensive alliance with the United States and strategic economic partner with China. Tell me, which country has this kind of relationship? Military alliance with the United States and close economic partnership with China. Secondly, China and Japan at present are competing fiercely for influence and leadership in ASEAN plus 3 in many international organizations. For example, ASEAN plus 3, 10 ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia plus 3, China, Japan, Korea. Or AMF, Asian Monetary Fund, or APEC, or Asian Regional Forum, and East Asian Summit. And China and Japan are competing in order to take the initiative in these international meetings. But South Korea does not do that because South Korea is locating in the middle. So about some years ago, 3 countries in the Far East, China, Korea, Japan, talked about the Besito air route line, Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo. But the Beijing-Seoul line were established, and Seoul-Tokyo lines were established. But there's no Besito line so far yet. So geographically, Seoul is between China and Japan on the one hand, and ASEAN countries on the other. And normative behavior. Seoul has been a good citizen. Seoul has been promoting in the last 2 or 3 decades human rights, market economy, anti-terrorism, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and knowledge sharing program by the President Park Geun-hye, but now currently K-Academics Diffusion Program by Moon Jae-in administration. So Seoul's basic position of ODA has changed from providing fish to developing countries, but now it turned to teaching how to catch fish. So Seoul does not give fish to developing countries. Instead, Seoul tries to teach developing countries how to catch fish. Particularly with the knowledge sharing program or K-Academics Diffusion Program. Now, Korean foreign policy is at a middle power. Since 2000s, Seoul has been actively involved in soft issues and taken the lead in addressing them. First, particularly leadership in human security. Seoul has demonstrated its leadership skills in the field of human security areas, including climate change, green development, sustainable development, anti-pirate operations, security of sea lanes, and peacekeeping operations. So Seoul has been focusing particularly on the human security issues in the past 2 or 3 decades. Second, 2010 G20 Summit meeting. At the 2010 G20 Summit, Korea gained support from other leaders when Korea emphasized the special considerations for non-membership middle powers and lesser powers. and pledged to reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. Unfortunately, this promise was not kept. A high-level forum on aid effectiveness. Korea became the first Asian country to host the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness in 2011, the so-called HLF4. So leaders from 160 plus countries participated, and they all agreed to fulfill the goals of poverty elimination and sustainable development by 2015. Seoul hold that meeting first time in Asia. Now, Green Climate Fund, among other things. In October 2012, Songdo in Incheon area was chosen as the site for the Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund, the so-called GCF. It is an international institution, and it's money coming from developed countries. Also, it aims to help developing countries reduce damages from climate changes and help them adjust to the changes. So the money, GCF, is the fund that would be used to help developing countries to adjust the climate change. Surprisingly, the GCF is called the second World Bank because it has a starting capital of US $100 billion. That's huge money, which is the third biggest financial organization in the world, next to IMF and World Bank. So South Korea was elected for the site for the Secretariat of the GCF.